understand complex social dynamics, such as the process of radicalization or electoral interference. And the problem was that all these like social listening tools baked in a series of analytical approaches that we really wanted to be able to manipulate ourselves as researchers. So rather than putting things into positive, negative, or neutral categories, which is what sentiment analysis allows you to do, we wanted to build algorithms to allow us to put the data into lots of other different categories as well. So Method 52 was born. It's really remained largely a creature which me and my research team use. You can see it, someone on this screen kind of building what we call architectures, kind of sticking together lots of components through which data flows. Some of these components have to do with collecting data from the kind of ever widening and ever more complex landscape of social media platforms, which we need to be able to analyze. So, you know, it started with Twitter, then it became Twitter and Facebook, and then added in Instagram, and then YouTube, and then Telegram. And now there's probably about a dozen different platforms which we collect from, as lots of different political groups are moving off actually Twitter and Facebook in the face of increasing enforcement on those platforms. We're seeing that fracturing and diversifying a lot. But then lots of components of Method 52 have to do with analytical work. So lots of kind of machine learning we use, lots of text analytics to basically try and make sense of the kind of enormous amounts of data which we often find ourselves being faced with. We built lots and lots of architectures at Chasm and ISD, and kind of over the years kind of formalized it into what we call Beam, which kind of logically looks like this. You'll notice we begin with these kind of 5 yellow boxes. So where analysts will start is they always want to kind of begin by kind of pulling kind of data kind of into our system, and that will either be typically kind of language-based queries, or it will be particular accounts which we're interested in understanding. So the first bit of Beam, the first bit of Method 52, will then reach across the whole internet as far as we can into all these different spaces we research, drag back as many messages, as much behavioral information as we can, and of course where it's compliant and legal for us to do so, turn that into a single format, which is far more difficult than it sounds, but you're kind of having to smoosh together often very different kinds of data to have to do that. And then you end up with a large amount of data that you want to then analyze. And then analysts will typically jump then into these other 4 boxes you see in red in front of you now: entities, narratives, users, and groups. Each of these is a kind of subroutine of Beam. Each of them is a collection of different architectures. And depending on what the analyst wants to do, at their fingertips, they'll largely probably decide to go to one of these 4 boxes next. Entities at the top is all about understanding kind of people, places, and organizations in whatever language present within all the messages. So entities present within all the messages. And to do that is a stack of technology called named entity recognition and geoparsing technology. So you might be interested in certain place names which are being mentioned, or you might be interested in certain people related to certain kind of organizations. You might want to start using knowledge graphs. But essentially, the entities as a subroutine will begin to show you of in a million messages who is being mentioned, in what languages, and distributed across what messages. Narratives is then, of course, all about actually understanding the narratives. And essentially what this subroutine does is it allows users to pry apart the different kinds of broad narratives which you have collected in a way which is meaningful to the analysts, using a technology we call natural language processing. So analysts will look at all the messages and they'll say, oh, look, here's 5 different narratives around climate change. 4 of them are broad mainstream political narratives, and one of them is a specific disinformation narrative, which they think might be trying to frustrate climate action. They then will start feeding examples of each of these narratives into an underlying language model. And over time, that language model, sometimes in hours, sometimes in days, or even weeks if it's super difficult, will begin to be able to recognize a difference between that disinformation narrative, for instance, and the other 3. And then we'll be able to do that at scale itself. Users Well, once you've found your problematic narrative, you might then go to the users bit of Beam, and this allows you to start looking at user level behavior. So of all these users, who've sent the disinformation narrative, who sent the most disinformation narratives, of those that have sent the most disinformation narratives, what else have they sent? So we start moving kind of higher in the kind of analytical layers of abstraction then, where we go just from the content to looking at more aggregated kind of behavioral kind of mapping onto users. And then lastly, groups is to go a level even higher and start looking at communities. So we might be interested in the way in which a particular group of accounts have all sent a lot of disinformation messaging behave with each other. Do they all tend to reply in the same way? Do they all tend to be active at the same time? Are they active across the same kinds of platforms? Has the narratives that they've been interested in tended to correlate with each other over that period of time? All of that kind of thing. And then typically, once analysts, these are all kind of analytical pathways, really, which kind of behave very dynamically. And as analysts bounce around all of these, they are typically doing kind of one of two things. Either they are feeding information back into the system as new data collection points, or they are outputting kind of analytical findings by way of results. Just as a quick example, so we say we care about about a theme that we're interested in knowing if there's disinformation around. We would collect new data collections. We would reach across the internet, feed all that in. The first place we would go then is narratives. We would train algorithms to identify those specific narratives. That would then be pushed into, say, a dashboard as a specific output in and of itself. How much of this narrative is really happening? How does it differ from the other narratives which are also being propagated? But then we probably would also be interested in the users that have sent that specific narrative and whether they've sent other narratives which might be related to disinformation. So analysts would then probably hop onto users and use that as a new input, which itself then might be a new output. So we would then enlarge the user list, and that might be a series of flags, for instance, that we're then interested in kind of producing as another kind of output. In terms of outputs, typically what we often are finding works best is a series of kind of highly bespoke dashboards, which we will create for a specific event or a specific kind of thematic area. Sometimes, so these are, say, dashboards which have been built, I believe, probably for state. Yeah, these are ones for state influence operations. And then other ones we built, for instance, around COP26, and we almost always build bespoke dashboards around other elections. I don't want to go like too far over time, but it's probably suffice it to say that the way that we're finding that kind of disinformation detection most often works is deploying kind of whatever kind of analytical technology you have, for us Beam, in kind of two ways. So firstly, we will try and deploy Beam in a kind of, oh, here I am. Sorry about my walls, by the way, I've just moved in. We deploy Beam in a kind of consistent way. So that would be to watch, say, over COP26 kind of language related conversations continuously. And that over time then allows us to basically spot specific campaigns which we believe are happening. So kind of constant monitoring. And then when we spot specific campaigns that are happening, and we have some sense of, let's say, the kind of language which are being used, or the accounts which may be involved, in the platforms which are being exploited, we then will use Beam in a kind of far more kind of investigatory, bespoke way, as we're kind of trying to pull those campaigns apart to understand how they work, the specific tactics or techniques which are being involved, and the harms which might be being caused, and as ever, and usually extremely tentatively, to kind of inch towards some kind of attribution claim if we possibly can. We as CASM are never going to be able to do much with the responses to influence operations. So we essentially are online researchers, but we always work with either civic society organizations or foundations or governments who, once given that kind of information, can then actually leverage a whole array of kind of responses to the problem. As a bigger picture, what we're really trying to do here, by the way, is in a sense like replicate and rebuild the kind of things which have happened largely in secret within the platforms themselves. So Facebook or Twitter or really any of the tech giants have all built kind of teams which kind of very dynamically, very constantly are attempting to kind of detect and mitigate disinformation and kind of deliberate and kind of malicious forms of influence on their platforms all the time, and they have for ages. The problem is that the tech giants, firstly, won't often release that information in a way which is completely transparent to civic society, and often actually, despite all their smarts and riches, really struggle to actually turn that the knowledge of an influence operation into something which will actually truly levy costs and risks and penalties upon the people that do it. Platforms themselves really can only really take down content. They can only ban accounts and they can only take down messaging. But there's a whole array really of other kind of, legal and activist and political and diplomatic and economic measures which we might take, for instance, against actors which wish to kind of intervene or interfere in elections, which tech giants have typically not been able to leverage themselves. So really what we're doing in building Beam and beginning to deploy this now around the world is to try and kind of rebuild that capability outside, do it in a way which is transparent, do it in a way which seeks to put civic society and the communities which are being hit by disinformation and allied campaigns at the heart of it, but then tap into this whole array of other ways of responding to it, which isn't just takedown, and that hopefully will levy much more kind of risk on the actors of it than takedown. Lastly, to say, final thought, in the world of disinformation research, there has been a huge overfocus on Facebook and Twitter because Facebook is big and because Twitter is collectible. From what we see, from what I see, all these kinds of campaigns and this kind of tradecraft are being exercised across a whole ton of platforms where there's barely any enforcement at all. So for anyone here that might be thinking about being worried about disinformation and how they might respond to it, I would be worried about Quora, I would be worried about Wikipedia, I would be worried about GitHub, I'd be worried about kind of, open and online communities which don't have a business model like Facebook and Twitter do to kind of run constant kind of dynamic detection and mitigation. Information warfare is a far, far broader based phenomenon than I think we suspect. And plenty of the places online don't have any kind of protective measures set up to try and defend against it. And it's now kind of expanding, I think, into local elections. It's expanding into big global causes around the world. It's expanding into sexual and reproductive rights organizations and discussions, of course, climate change, and of course, elections. So there's more than enough for us to do. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. I opted for this one in the end because I think there's a lot of mystique around all this research, and there's lots of kind of magical proprietary algorithms and clever machine learning which are never really discussed, and really a lot of this isn't rocket science whatsoever. So I thought I would delve into it just for these 20 minutes when I have your attention and try and give you at least a little glimpse as to how these methodologies work and how they glue together. Hope it was helpful. Thanks, Ben.
Brilliant, thanks, Carl. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I've got loads of questions, but I will wait till I've used my position of chair till the end, and I'm glad I managed to get your camera working ultimately as well. Our next speaker is Lisa Sugiura. She's Senior Lecturer in Criminology and Cybercrime at the University of Portsmouth. She's also Deputy Director of the Cyber Awareness Clinic, which is a project running in collaboration with Hampshire Police that supports the local community becoming more resilient to cyber threats. Lisa, over to you, and hopefully we've ironed out all the technical difficulties now, so there won't be any more.
Thank you, Ben. I'll just share my screen. If somebody could let me know if you can see the slides, okay, that would be marvellous. Thank you. So,
Not
everybody
yet.
see the screen?
Not yet, no.
Let's have a look.
Yes.
How's that?
Got it.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. So thank you, everybody, for coming along to this talk today, and particularly to Professor Stephen Tong, who invited me. I'm grateful to be here and to share my research with you all. As part of my broader research interests in gender and cybercrime, I've been researching the involuntary celibate community for nearly 4 years. I studied incels by spending time in incel forums and websites, as well as conducting interviews with current and former self-identifying incels in order to understand their formation and culture. The purpose of the research was to understand incels' motivations and behaviours, as well as the evolution and spread of the incel community. I wanted to raise awareness of the harms arising from the misogynistic ideologies within incel and other groups online, which had been previously operating relatively undetected, often due to being dismissed as minority fringe groups. In this talk, I'll discuss the context of the incel community, as well as the broader manosphere, and show how these did not occur in isolation. Rather, misogynistic ideologies are rooted in the belief systems of pre-established men's rights groups and broader societal structures. However, digital technologies and social media can, and indeed do, play a role in propagating violence and hatred against women, particularly the ways in which anti-feminist rhetoric on platforms such as YouTube, Reddit and 4chan are presented as harmless or satirical media in the forms of images, videos and memes. But before I properly begin, I'd like to note that some of the content I'm referring to could be upsetting. This was a challenging topic to research and these are difficult issues to speak about, as well as difficult issues to listen to. So please take care of yourselves. So incel is a portmanteau of the words involuntary and celibate. Those who adopt the name view themselves as unsuccessful in obtaining sex and romantic relationships with those they desire. The etymology of the term can be traced to a queer female student, Alana Boltwood, in 1993, who, in seeking support from like-minded others on her website, described incel as anybody of any gender who was lonely, had never had sex, or who hadn't had a relationship in a long time. There are still some who align themselves with this vision of a gender-inclusive community, not least the female incels, the femcels, those who identify as non-gender binary, and men who actively reject misogyny. However, incel has foremost been appropriated by men and come to represent a subculture crystallized in its hatred of women. The majority of incels are now in fact men, and to date there have been no issues or concerns regarding female incels in terms of propagating hatred against others or engaging in violent enactments. The incel community recognisable today has developed online since the mid-2000s and has been gaining increased attention more recently. Now, I appreciate that for some, the term incel might be relatively new and something you might not have heard about before the abhorrent attacks committed in Plymouth in August last year. Firstly, I want to pay my respects to the victims and families affected by that tragedy and all those who've suffered any forms of gender violence. This was far from the first mass murder linked with incels. Indeed, prior to what happened to Plymouth, academics at the University of Western Australia found that incels have been linked to the killings of at least 50 people and injuries of at least 38 more since 2014, in attacks most notoriously in Isla Vista, California, Oregon, Edmonton, Alberta, New Mexico, Parkland, Florida, Toronto, Canada, and Tallahassee, including a 2014 case in Portsmouth, with other attacks here in the UK before Plymouth thwarted. These are statistics comparable to the number of victims of Islamic extremism in the same period. Now, these are Western examples, though, and there is limited knowledge as to further incel-related attacks occurring in other countries, although recent cases in Japan, for example, suggest that the incel problem is growing globally. It is also important to note that some incel-related attacks are just that, related, and the connection has been made by others, rather than a direct admission from the perpetrators themselves. The situation is somewhat clearer when a manifesto is left behind or a full warning posted on social media in which inceldom is stipulated as the motivation. However, in many situations, we may never know the true motivation for such horrific atrocities. Regardless of specific motivation, though, the common denominator, what is often the elephant in the room, is some men's violence against women and how broader misogynistic structures and patriarchal systems of socialization enable, normalize, and embolden such abuses. Psychologist Jack Sawyer stated in 1970 that male liberation calls for men to free themselves from the sex role stereotypes that limit their ability to be human. Stereotypes included how men related to women, questions of power and dominance in public and private life, and the ability to fully express emotions. Initially, the mutual damage impacting women and men from patriarchal gendered expectations, so women's importance is in their looks, whilst men's is in their financial success, was recognised by both the women's and men's liberation groups, and there was an alliance in dismantling these structures. However, the men's rights movement later experienced much discord, predominantly fueled by apprehensions from cisgender white men about their perceived diminishing social status and being victims of the natural social order. Responding to the sexual revolution of the 1960s and negatively misconstruing second wave feminism resulted in a volte-face, whereby feminism became the adversary. These ideas have since advanced, underpinning the formation of contemporary men's rights groups online. So incel as a subculture is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a larger backlash against feminism propelled by the Manosphere. The Manosphere consists of groups of men all connected by the belief that feminine values have corrupted society, and some men need to retaliate against this misandrous culture to preserve their very survival. The term Manosphere was popularised by author and pornography marketeer Ian Ironwood, who published a book collating blogs and forums about perceived male struggles titled The Manosphere, A New Hope for Masculinity. Digital technologies have facilitated these manosphere spaces, what Masanari terms toxic technocultures. These are a loosely connected and amorphous hub for men's issues, noted for its virulent anti-feminism, extreme misogyny, and connections with the alt-right. The uniting ideological feature of the Manosphere is an antipathy towards feminism and a pervading sense of often white male victimization. Groups within the Manosphere involve men's rights activists, pickup artists, men going their own way, tradcons, no-fappers, fathers for justice, as well as incels. Although the main interests of each group may differ, their common language creates a unified identity. Men's rights activists are driven by anger and want to effect change, namely a return to the traditional values where women are subordinate to men. Women need to be put back in their place, and to do so, abuse of women, particularly feminists, is encouraged. Now, despite what its name may imply, men go in their own way, or MGTOW for short, so members of this group weaponize homophobia in order to solidify their heterosexuality in a space that rejects women, and they use online harassment to police the borders of hegemonic and toxic masculinity. The MGTOW movement differs slightly from much of the Manosphere, as it generally rejects any form of relationship with women, although it is noted that some members do have sex with women and are even married to women, but the same issues of violence and harassment are present. MGTOW, in rejecting the demands of what they perceive to be Western geocentrism, are influenced by the mythopoetic movement led by poet and author Robert Bly, who suggested that men should return to their ingrained nature by embracing homosocial solidarity. Pickup artists view women as mere objects, bodies to be tricked into sex. There is no consideration of women as autonomous human beings worthy of honesty or respect. Moreover, women are viewed as simply shallow and motivated by looks and money, and are thus fair game to be deceived and used for sexual purposes. Pickup artistry is informed by a hegemonic ideal of what it is to be masculine, benefiting off the self-help movement and evident in the lad culture and banter so pervasive in contemporary society, and which had significant impact upon the development of ladette culture as well in the 1990s and 2000s. It was Neil Strauss's 2005 book, The Game, that helped pickup artistry permeate the mainstream. This notion of striking back at the female population and viewing women's only value as their appearance and sexual object is certainly at the core of not just pickup artistry activity, but also incel ideology. Tradcon is short for traditional conservative. Persons within this group advocate on behalf of traditional values such as family morality and gendered roles. However, the Incel Wiki describes this term as a slur used for identity politics, and so claims that there are few that would actually identify as a Tradcon as a result. No fappers are men seeking to abstain from pornography and masturbation because they believe that this will enable them to preserve testosterone and achieve greater sexual power and enlightenment. There is a crossover with other misogynistic and anti-Semitic groups such as the Proud Boys, who before apparently disbanding in May 2021 had a policy of #NoWanks. Unlike the aforementioned groups residing in the Manosphere, the primary focus for fathers' rights activists, with Fathers for Justice being the most well-known, is actual men's problems rather than espousing vitriol against women, progressiveness and feminism. Fathers for Justice are concerned with paternal rights and ensuring that fathers have access to their children when relationships break down, when criminal justice systems entrenched in what they deem sexist conservative ideals ordinarily operate in favour of the mother. In this respect, the continuation of traditional gender roles, desire and ideal of other groups in the manosphere marginalises men and devalues their status as parents. In the manosphere, the red pill and blue pill analogy popularised by the film The Matrix is used to what Debbie Ging describes as awaken men to feminism's misandry and brainwashing. Someone who is blue-pilled blindly believes the delusions of the world. Whatever the society tells them to do, they believe that women are capable of being equal to men, that feminism is a good concept, that women like nice gentlemen, and treating women with respect will make men attractive. In reality, it's a term basically used as an insult to anybody who disagrees with them. However, taking the red pill means the person has rejected society's ideals, realised and woken up that feminism is a disastrous concept, that nice gentlemen are not preferred by women, and that they like bad guys instead. Incels have created a third pill, that of the black pill, which once metaphorically consumed, shows the uncontested nature of reality, that the world is ordered against low status men in favour of women and alpha males. It is impossible to evade this systemic oppression. Genetically inferior men are and will always be socially disadvantaged, whilst women are biologically equipped to desire conventionally attractive and rich male partners. The black pill cements the realisation of being an incel. It is comprised of commonly held beliefs in the incel community and elsewhere in the manosphere, namely hypergamy, which is dating or marrying up, namely the belief that women will only mate with high status males, the just be white or sexual racism theory that women will primarily choose white men to be their sexual or romantic partners, the 80-20 rule of dating, so 80% of women desire and compete for the top 20% of men, and conversely, the bottom 80% of men are competing for the bottom 20% of women. Lookism, which is improving your appearance to increase the chances of sexual success, and the halo effect, that men who look good are perceived better than men who don't. Black-pilled incels seek evidence to support their claims, relying on pseudoscience and uncritical interpretations of evolutionary biology and psychology studies, and studies undertaken by dating sites. Feminism is the scourge of all men's, but especially incels' problems, and obstacles due to genetics, such as physical unattractiveness, as perceived by incels themselves, cannot be overcome. Essentially, the black pill is constructed from statistics used to validate incel perspectives, and images and memes are used to describe and visualize incel thoughts and feelings, which are generally bleak and denigrating women for being egocentric, cruel, and shallow. In becoming black-pilled, incels are embracing fatalism. They are the Zeta males who will never attract the women they want, and so reject women and societal values regarding relationships and equality, which often manifests as hatred. Now, although the incitement of hatred is not explicitly part of the black pill philosophy, the deprecation of women and progressiveness is occurring nonetheless. Hence, though violence isn't necessarily sanctioned by the incel community, the ideology presenting mixed messages about men needing to retaliate against women and the society that has supposedly privileged them, along with posts celebrating the actions of those who have committed violent atrocities, whether or not they're made in satire, is undeniably attractive to those with a predisposition for violence. Now, incels place looks on a numerical scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the greatest value. And now this is in order to rate and compare the innate value of an individual. With the incel sphere, memes are in abundance, featuring Chads and Stacys, which refer to the most attractive men and women. The meme, Millimeters of Bone, involves side-by-side photos of similar-looking men beside the caption. The difference between Chad and non-Chad is literally a few millimeters of bone, illuminating the incel claim that women are more biologically drawn to men with more prominent chins and jaws. Parody versions of cartoon characters also feature within memes, such as handsome and regular Squidward, Shrek with exaggerated facial expressions, and Hercules transitioning from an awkward teenager into his muscular adult form. Alongside these seemingly innocuous memes, there are those with more insidious connotations, including the aborted GF, which suggests that an incel's potential girlfriend was aborted in utero and propels anti-abortion advocates to try and attract incels to their cause. Such memes are deprived of their provenance and edit history and downplayed as satire or cultural in-jokes, meaning it's difficult for observers to appreciate and contextualize what they have been presented with. For many, the first time they've encountered the term incel was on places like Reddit, which then piques their curiosity to learn more, resulting in Googling the term and being exposed to the wider communities within the manosphere and the red pill and black pill ideologies. Although often the more mainstream platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and the well-known incel sites and forums on places like Reddit are frequented by those in the incel community, rather than notorious places such as 4chan and 8chan, which are renowned for abuse and offensive behaviours. Some people within the communities are directed to more extreme incel spaces after searching for support and advice about relationships. Others actively seek out incel spaces after reading about incels in the mainstream media, most notably after the term was associated with high-profile attacks. It does appear that the same people are members of incel groups across different platforms, although there are probably many more people who identify as incel or at least align with the incel philosophy, but do not describe themselves in this way on spaces that aren't ordinarily incel related due to the negativity directed towards the community. There is also the recognised overlap with the other manosphere groups and conflation of anybody who expresses misogynistic views as being an incel. An argument propagated within incel communities is because incels didn't exist in the past, when gender roles were more rigidly enforced and women had less rights, that this negates feminists' explanation for incels being caused by the patriarchy or toxic masculinity. However, this dispute is inherently flawed, as it only further signifies that incels are indeed a reaction to societal progression and gender equality. Moreover, the contribution of what Powell et al. Term the digital society, which enables communities to assimilate together on and offline in a union of hatred and violence, has been overlooked. Incels do not exist and do not solely occur within an online vacuum. Their worldview has roots in and is validated by broader society, from the subtle instances of sexism to the blatant discriminations espoused within respected figures in politics and the media. Although it is noted that if it were not for the internet, incels would not have formed in the mass and manner they have. Internet culture is at the core of the incel community, as seen in their idiosyncratic language. And were it not for the global reach and communicative properties of being online, incels as a distinguishable group, and certainly using this name, would not prevail. The digital self is still very much part of the physical. However, because of the understanding of the perceptions towards incels, that part of one's identity is carefully managed offline as per Goffman's presentation of self. It is not as though incels are one person online and then another offline. Rather, that part of their persona is kept hidden in face-to-face interactions because they are aware of how they will be treated otherwise. It is unjust, however, to suggest the whole incel community verges towards violence and hatred, where it is mostly concentrated on self-loathing and solidarity seeking. A poignant issue is that vulnerable men visit incel forums seeking support. However, instead of getting the help they need, they are taught to hate themselves to the point that their lives are worthless. Suicide ideation is prevalent within the incel sphere. There are real risks of a generation of men, particularly young men, being indoctrinated to self-loathe and blame women for it. The profuse misogyny and indulgence in narcissistic, violent fantasies is clearly inexcusable and harmful to women and wider society. But the depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation demonstrates that being part of the community is also harmful to incels themselves. It is imperative that the threats posed from the ideologies within the incel community and broader manosphere are not left unchecked. There are significant risks to not only women, society, and incels themselves, but also to Western democracy and progressiveness. For too long, there has been a reactive approach to misogyny, with terrible incidents such as high-profile murders of women or incel-related attacks, evoking public interest in misogyny, when in reality, the hatred of women has been able to flourish both on and offline, unabated and often unchallenged. There is a virtual war against women, a war which is fought through the dehumanization of women and ideological tactics in private online spaces, as well as the public mainstream. And this increases in prevalence whenever women make equality gains and or substantially challenge men's violence against them. If we don't confront this issue, society risks becoming regressive, and systems of oppression will continue harming everybody, irrespective of gender. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That's fascinating, if not a little concerning. I'll come back for some questions on that as well, let's hope so. Our final speaker is David Baily. He's National Police Chiefs Council's social media strategic subject matter expert, which is a fantastic title. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Ben. And that's only part of the day job, so we'll crack into it. So hopefully you can see the screen.
Yeah, we've got that, yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction now for the next 15 to 20 minutes and talk about the more overt and public-facing use of social media in policing that we're on. But I thought we'd start off with a brief timeline of our time in social media and policing, and go back to when Facebook and Twitter were just an idea in somebody's dorm room. Policing resisted social media very early on, particularly at senior leadership level, and we had quite a slow start into it. It was very much a case of a handful of pioneers, and you had chief officers saying that this won't last, this won't be around very long, it's just a fad. Early in 2007 or so, when it was the Association of Chief Police Officers, we wrote the Engage Guide, and that was the first time any work had been done collaboratively using a wiki, actually. So just shows that policing can embrace the technology. And then we probably all remember the Summer Disorder of 2011, which really was a turning point in terms of the police proactive use of social media for engagement and for managing the way our communities interact with us. The forces, some forces struggled, some forces really excelled, being able to engage with the communities. And then we seemed to grow through the period of time. And in fact, the first ever Facebook case study on a non-profit-making organisation was actually on my home force, Staffordshire Police at the time, back in 2014. It wasn't until around 2019 we actually stood up a national programme to actually look at designing how social media should be used proactively by policing. And at that point, it was probably in recognition that everything had become about Twitter in police terms, and we weren't getting as much value from it. So we worked on a national programme, which I had the privilege of leading, to understand and to design our way forward beyond the perhaps organic way we'd grown in terms of use of it. You'll see here there's been 3 national public surveys into the use of social media. This is work I've led over the years, which started off when I was doing my CIPR, Charles Institute of Public Relations work, to try and understand the perception of our social media use by the users, by the communities, and I think that was the most important part. So what did the social media programme actually bring together? Well, for the first time ever, we had a national vision for how we want to use social media, and it was a typical Be Most approach. The public will have the choice, confidence to engage, report and interact with their local police using the digital channels that most suit their needs. And on the flip side of that coin, of course, we needed to empower the police service to be able to do this effectively with the tools that they need and to be able to tackle the issues the most. So just having that vision in mind really helped to focus on what we should do forward. So how did we understand what the public wanted to get out of social media? So we've done it 3 times. We tend to do it every couple of years or so, but we are looking at increasing the frequency because the value is so high, where we actually ask the users of social media, our core social media accounts, for their detailed perception surveys, and we get phenomenal results. Last year's survey got nearly 30,000 results from members of the public across the 3 core platforms, across 43 different forces, all doing this as a local survey because we're able to build it that way and have that really strong evidence base. And the beauty, of course, is we can benchmark that data going back a couple of years. Why did we need this? Well, there's lots of myths around the police and public use of social media. And we started off with just the age profile. It's for those young people. Well, take a look at Facebook and Twitter age profiles. It's getting older. Not a surprise to many of us. But at very early stage, we needed to explain what each channel does. And of course, being able to explain to our leaders who aren't as embedded in social media that the platforms are all different and the way they work and are used by the communities is different. We focus on the core platforms where the public expect us to be. And that's a really important point. There's so many social media platforms. Trying to be everywhere is a real challenge. And remembering that the average member of the public uses 7 different platforms. Do we need to be on every platform, which has tended to be the approach, or we're really good on the platforms where they expect to see us most? What are the public, the citizens we are serving, actually interested in? Because it has to be, and if you think about the Grunig and Hood PR models, do we want to be propagandist in terms of telling the people what we want them to know, or do we need to be more asymmetrical or even symmetrical in terms of our communication with the public? The most important thing is the immediacy and relevancy. And that's what social media is today. It's about relevancy. It's about things that are of interest to you. The algorithms across all the platforms are constantly being developed to serve your needs. So for policing, we've got to really make sure that the information we're putting out there is interesting to the public, because otherwise we're just noise in the background. If we're going to do the work on social media, we really have to be relevant and timely. And you can see there, in terms of what the public are most likely to like or share, it's appeals. They want to help the police, and that goes back to the Baily principles. The public are the police are the public. We need that, but they also want it about updates about incidents happening now, so they can make their own decisions, not incidents that happened yesterday. And just think about what that trigger is. It's about people being concerned. They want to know what's happening. Do they need to take action? What action should they take? Interestingly, of course, crime prevention, we were putting a lot of crime prevention out early on, and it wasn't really interesting to the public. What we've been able to do by using the survey is tailor crime prevention and attach it to incident updates. Relevancy, making it matter. Most people don't think they're going to be a victim of crime, but if there's something happening in their area, you can make it feel personalised and social and important to that person. You can then attach those crime prevention reports to things and get that more traction and hopefully trigger action. Importantly, though, 44% of the people who filled in this 10-minute 30-question survey said they would never like, share or comment on our social posts. Therefore, they wouldn't leave a digital measurable metric output, but they still valued our posts so much that they filled in this huge survey for us. So how many other people are reading and consuming our content but don't want to leave a digital footprint? So measuring the metrics really takes a different way forward. It also goes into the trust and confidence area as well. The first question we always have to ask ourselves in policing is, why are we doing something? What value does it add to the overall policing mission? It's not our job to entertain on social media. It's our job to be part of the community. And of course, with the challenges we've had over the last 2 years, how do you increase your visibility when nobody's out? And social media has played an important part in there. So we ask our respondents about where do they go for information and who do they trust to have the information that's right. And of course, it's our Facebook and our social media accounts that matter. The official blue ticked accounts are the ones that they turn to above all the sources. I always used to say that everything's true on the internet until somebody says something that you trust more on another account. And that's certainly been the case as we've learned over social media over the years, that we have to be the credible, trusted voice for the public at all times. So it's about making sure that we feed that, and that helps to grow confidence in the wider police service. And we've done lots of analysis in terms of how does making sure that relevant content served in a timely way help to build that trust and confidence, which is the core of modern policing, given the Baily principles and everything we're doing. So how do we build that confidence, that trust, given the pressures that we're under at the moment? Social media being personalised is really vital to it. But the trust rubs elsewhere, as point. The force websites become that voice, that credible, trusted voice. The public want to hear from the police. Everybody's become far more sophisticated in terms of the way they validate news, understand what's going on. They use multiple sources. And one of the worst things you can have is contradiction when you're trying to get a community message out. So when there's a time of crisis or concern, ensuring that messages are replicated across social media, website, and traditional media channels, but also the face-to-face work of our officers, It's absolutely vital that trust can grow and be influenced across the board. And of course, we have to keep moving that forward and constantly challenge that. It takes a lot longer to build the trust than it does to damage it, as we've seen very often at the moment. So you can see there the level of trust that we build in our local feeds that can actually counteract misinformation that's on other channels. So if they're all very well putting the information out there, but social media, there's a clue in the name, it's social, it's interactive. And one of the things we were keen to understand was how much do the public actually want to inbound messages to policing and expect a response. So this is quite old data now, but it's replicated and it hasn't really changed since we started doing the survey back in 2016. That if people are taking the time to connect to our social media accounts, regardless of channel, they have really high trust in the account. Until such point they ask a question that's not reporting a crime, but that could be included as well, and expected a response and didn't get it. And we damage the trust that we've built in that community by not being seen to be responsive and not being seen to listen. So there is a really strong conclusion here. If we fail to listen to respond, we decrease the trust in our service in general. So we really have to make sure that interactivity is really there, and the demand and expectation on us to be interactive has only grown over the last few years. So again, it's really vital we build an approach that works on that. So getting back to the vision of what we set out to do, I had the privilege of telling all the chief constables that we were unconsciously incompetent on social media, but I had the evidence to back that up. So we designed an approach which is focusing on the people, the processes and the technologies to make the target operating model, so that we had that consistent, informed approach to our approach to social media. How can we make sure we're continuously improving the way that we are serving the public in the virtual community? Because it matters. It's not a different community, it's the same community. And if we go back to the 2011 disorder, being confident and being assured on the disorder helped us to reduce the actual instance of disorder going back there. And you can have numerous examples of this every single day across policing. So we had to design an operating model. We have to make sure that social media is seen at the same level as other interactions. It's always been almost that free thing that goes on at the side. Why do we need to invest in it? But the public have changed. You know, the way that Twitter has now become the best way of complaining to a company to get action, their expectations come on public sector very similarly. You know, the way that people are less likely to ring an 0800 number now to make a complaint to access customer service. You can do it freely through your social media account. Those concerns come the same way. Also, if you think about the amount of appeals that we proactively put out, which the public really want to help us with, should we be shocked when they don't ring the number 101 or Crime Stoppers and actually give the response back on social media where we ask them? So we have to build our approach that allows us to be able to do that. So creating that equality between the channels and platforms, whether it's a letter, a telephone call, a form filled in on a website, or a social media direct message, they all matter to the public as much as anything else. But also, we love silos in policing. A call for service is dealt with by the control room. Intelligence is dealt with by the dark people who hide behind the door. Local policing teams do the engagement and reassurance. But the member of the public who's interacting with the service doesn't know which part of the organisation is going to deal with them. So if we have too many accounts, too much direction, nobody deals with them, which is again a service failure. And we actually create more demand on the service through 101 and 999. So regardless of which channel the public use, we have to make decisions based on the information we have, and regardless of the channel they use, the public will make their judgment of the police service based on their experiences. So we have to bring it all together and create that quality across the board. So we developed the social media TOM, the target operating model, which focused on those elements, and it was about breaking down the silos, or actually leveraging the silos to make them work for us. The contact centre are the best people at triaging and dealing with demand, understanding what's going on. The corporate comms team can spend more time actually being really creative and making sure their content stands out, and that when we're doing an appeal, the public see it and can target it really effectively. The local policing team know what matters to the community, and they've got the fantastic stories that help build their confidence. So how do we bring those all together? Well, we can build the processes, but we also have to look at the technology. So what we built was a technical requirement in terms of what we need to be able to do. Because consider this, we get a significant number of disclosure around sexual offences through social media, because the idea of somebody actually phoning us up and telling us over the phone, compared to perhaps typing and sending that private message on Facebook to us, that opens up the opportunity to open that first disclosure. But if we're going to take crime reports, incident reports, we have to be able to treat that to the same standards as a 999 or a 101 call. So how do we evidence a DM message on Twitter that could be deleted by the user? How do we secure that first best disclosure in a way that's tamper evidence and could stand up to the scrutiny of a barrister in court? All that had to be built into the process, but then also how do we make sure that we can triage through the control room, get updates for the community from the local policing team, but there's a seamless citizen experience. Going back to the police national digital strategy, creating that seamless citizen experience. The public doesn't need to know who's dealing with them. They just need to know the force is dealing with them, and they get a really prompt reply. So that's why we built a social media technical framework, and that we tested the industry and made sure that all forces can actually, and all the blue light partners, etc., can actually use that framework. So we've got a common industry standard that helps us leverage and influence the tools that we need, because there's a lot of social media management tools that can't provide the evidence that we need to be able to keep that confidence in policing. So how are we getting on in terms of the implementation of this? You can see there the numbers and the spread we've got in terms of the forces who adopted the operating model already, and it continuously grows. They're bringing the technology in place, they're building control rooms in there, and the benefits of the control rooms is it's more channel choice, not channel shift. We're not trying to tell the public not to ring us, but we're giving them choice. And if digital is the quicker and easier option with the less friction, why not use digital? And it's a lot cheaper across the board for policing to be able to do that, and more effectively as well. So what does that mean in real life? Now, this is slightly old data because I'm not as close to it as I was, but we were getting 999 emergencies that weren't being monitored on social media. That's not acceptable. 100 in this period here, March to August, there was 113 grade 1 responses in Staffordshire that they needed to respond to crimes or incidents that were reported via social media. Grade 2 is within an hour. We've got to be there. There's over 1,100 crimes there that we need to be dealing with. But interestingly as well, the things that help us to protect the public, intel, 752 intelligence reports that are actionable and allow us to go and take criminals off the streets. Also, the bottom number there, nearly 3,000 opportunities to deflect calls for service that aren't for policing to the relevant organisation in a matter of seconds, but with a more positive outcome for the member of the public. If you've waited 15 minutes on 101 to get answered and be told it's the council you've got to ring, you're not going to be very satisfied. If within a few seconds of you sending a message on a social media post and you're given a link to the organisation that can deal with it, we often get a thank you and a more positive outcome. And you can see the way the public rate it. And it's not a one-off. When we implemented in Surrey and Sussex, in Surrey Police as well, similar sort of picture, grade 1 incidents. And actually, we often got a richer picture of what was going on and able to resource that incident better from the starting point, because we were getting messages, we were getting the GPS locations straight away. Again, that deflection. What sort of crimes we're getting? Lots of other offences, anything almost in terms of crimes. Quite a good proportion of ASB. But also suspicious activity, and again being able to be seen to be responding to that helps to build that trust and that confidence in the public as we move forward. So the social media operating model, empowered by technology that works, really vital to how we do it. But in terms of being proactive on social media, there's lots of pitfalls, but what we should always be doing is thinking about what does good look like. Why are we posting something on social media? Particularly when it can go wrong. Who's the audience we need to reach? If we're doing a crime appeal for a suspect who we believe is in a small town in the middle of a county, do we need to tell everybody in the US about it? Can we target and use the algorithm in our benefit to target specific audiences based on geography or demographics so that we can get that instant appeal back? So what's the operational or tactical objective we're trying to do? And let's not measure it by it went viral. Let's measure it on the success of, did we get the intelligence? Did we get the information that actually enables us to do it? Because that's what success looks like. So, you know, if we put a social post out about people we want to arrest in relation to football disorder, and within an hour and a half we've made appointments for them all to come into custody, and we take all the images down, that is real success, even if we only reach a few thousand people. If it went viral, and think about occasions when something is really interesting, the Ross Geller shoplifter from Blackpool comes to mind. You know, how much demand did that create that didn't actually help to bring the offender to justice? Do we want to influence or change behaviour, or influence opinion? The neighbourhood policing, building that confidence and rapport, and then that building capacity to do the other two is the other way I think of it. So the pictures of the puppies in the police helmet, you know, they're ones that help to build that interest, because that's what matters. I can talk about a case where we helped to find a missing person who was attempting to commit suicide, because we were connected to the right person at the right time. At 2 a.m, we needed to get an appeal out to people in a small Pacific area. But because somebody had been attracted to our content and built that connection with us, they were able to give that information, and actually provided the information through social media that the control room can then dispatch, and then we can tell the public what we've done with that. So that's what the operating and what our overt and public use of social media means. It means reducing the number of accounts. You know, we've got to be easy to find. At one stage, we had over 5,000 Twitter accounts in policing in England and Wales. Well, how, as you, as a member of the public, will you know which account carries the information that's relevant? So we had to really think about the design and the approach to our public social media, being really good where expected, targeting the audiences, understanding our audiences, and most of all, being interactive and building that trust so that when we need it, they can come to us. Think about the London Bridge and those sort of incidents. That's when we really are able to help to keep people safe and feel safe. Ben, I'm going to hand back to yourself now. Thank you.
Great, thanks ever so much, David. Really, really interesting. I'm actually just about to start a project, well, have just started a project with a number of colleagues looking at some of these issues, so I suspect I'll be tapping you up for an interview at some point soon, like that. We've got some questions in for the panel, so if I could ask all the panel members to turn their cameras on. There are some specific questions and some cross-cutting ones, but I think we'll go right back to Carl, actually. Because this question came in early on for you, Carl, which is, do you think that Facebook Metaverse and presumably associated efforts or similar efforts are going to make all this stuff harder to monitor and harder to deal with?
Yeah, I do. I think that's explicitly coming from the tech companies as well. So you've got a kind of you've got a trajectory here of online content becoming more immersive as well as becoming more difficult to control. The real kind of worry on the horizon, though, actually isn't with the metaverse, which, by the way, looks like Second Life. Really, it's actually if decentralization is more fully kind of moved into the kind of heart of online services that we all use. So it's technically completely feasible to run a social media platform, a company, a political action organization, a fundraising organization, all now baked into decentralized architectures. So blockchain, crypto. Now, if you've got a social media platform in crypto, who does Ofcom pick up the phone to? Who do you fine? Who do you sanction? Who does the police get into contact with? You have there really platforms which are deliberately, in many cases, being built to be completely unamenable to the levers of the state. That is a regulatory nightmare that is darkening on the horizon right now. I would kind of be less concerned, actually, if I saw more concern from government, like and a kind of a greater degree of alarm from regulators and people think about this. But the fact there is barely a ripple so far coming from the people that think about kind of the regulation of political content, hate speech and so on, kind of leads me to be more concerned, because I do think we still are kind of building kind of regulatory frameworks and systems to deal with companies, which we've always been able to deal with, essentially, and not these really new kinds of entities which might be way more kind of part of our everyday lives in the years ahead.
And then this is the question I had to abuse my position of chair. as chair, which is, and I'm sure there are technical definitions of what counts as fake news and misinformation and disinformation and so forth. But I'm just wondering how you differentiate between those things and just people being wrong in terms of actionable intelligence, passing on material to police officers to do something about it. How do you draw those kinds of lines in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever passed a piece of disinformation on to police officers to do anything, I think, because it certainly doesn't pass any kind of criminal threshold. It doesn't pass any threshold that we would have as researchers to believe there's a serious threat to life. To be honest, I find the descriptive disinformation to be massively unhelpful. I mean, it means technically the kind of deliberate propagation of an untruth. But as I said, like really, if you pull apart like campaigns which we think have been done by Russia or China or Iran or actually tons of other countries as well, including ones, you know, liberal democratic nations, typically like a very small part of it really is explicitly lying. Like much more of it is like cherry picking of some truths and, you know, and the elimination of others. And way more of it is really to do with making people angry about things they already believe to be unjust about the world, and then kind of directing that anger in one direction or another. That's like a far more tried and tested and powerful kind of influence kind of framework than lying. So I think there's a big gap really between the kind of like disinformation as a policy concern and a media trope, and really actually it as part of a kind of tradecraft of kind of influence operation. So we're much more interested in basically covert, organized kind of like platform manipulation efforts really, which bundle together all these different techniques, and really only in specific scenarios. So elections, summits, wars, and targeted harassment.
Okay, brilliant. And the next question is actually for Lisa. And well, there's two. There's one from the audience and another one from me, I'm afraid. The first one is from the audience. And it's I think it's a question asking you to get in the mindset of some of the people you are studying. So if women's choices are based on biologically choosing men, how do incel groups justify their hate, which, you know, biological determinism says it's not your fault? That's the way
yeah. Well, it's because it's manipulated. I mean, yeah, so it's essentially they have shifted it to their worldview, so that because then there's this evidence and obviously in their perspective that women are inherently and naturally evil and predetermined to only seek out good-looking rich men, that then does give them license to hate them, because obviously it's putting them in a disadvantaged position. So yes, this is, I mean, everything that they draw on as evidence is it is turned to obviously how they want to interpret it. So yeah, they draw on evolutionary theory and psychology, but I say it's uncritical, it's unnuanced. They basically cherry pick what aligns with their perspectives to then obviously inform it and validate it.
Yeah. Thanks. And my question was this: I'm generally one of the people who tends to think there's nothing new under the sun. And the way that people behave now is probably quite similar to the way they've behaved for a long time in the past. But I think I'm probably wrong about that. And you touched on it in your speak about this is a part of internet culture. This is something that's been created by the internet. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about the kind of whether that, you know, could you give a bit more detail on that? Do you think it's really, you know, this would not have happened? There weren't really people who thought like this in the past?
No, that's not my argument at all. I tend to agree with you, actually. Is that, you know, my actual point is that this is old-fashioned misogyny, really. It's just found a new avenue. It's just dressed up in what seems like something particularly novel in digital culture. But at the root of it, the ideology is actually nothing particularly new or special. It's, you know, it's patriarchy. So no, I mean, I really didn't want to kind of give that impression that obviously, and actually one of my biggest concerns is that if we think of incels or other groups in the manosphere as something unique, something novel, then it actually detracts from the wider societal problems of misogyny, and so no, I want to kind of show it as almost like a continuum, really. But obviously the technology is enabling it in new ways, and it's reinforcing it, it's validating it, and it's infiltrating in the mainstream, and there's obviously the risks then where it's seen as something familiar and everyday.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you. David, this is a question for you, which I think is aimed at the extent to which we were talking about police using social media across a very wide range of operations and towards a very wide range of ends. And this is the question: will this result, so this movement, I guess, in the police becoming too reliant on social media as a source of public information, particularly if fake news is becoming prevalent, which could increase police workload and in a sense kind of pervert it in troubling directions?
There's more work involved in actually understanding the platform and filtering it, but not in terms of more demand. We really don't believe that we have to deal with anyway. We've been able to prove that moving people to social media and digital channels to report actually doesn't reduce the demand on the service. What it does enable us to do is to deal with the demand more effectively, because it's a lot easier to deal with. And actually, if you think about it, we've never said we don't want the public to contact us with information that helps us tackle crime or is about crimes that have happened. We are always asking people to do that so we can make people's better. In terms of the intelligence side, that's not my area. We keep a clear boundary or a moat between the intelligence and the public engagement work, because there has to be. We cannot be using the same sort of approaches to when we're investigating and gathering intelligence or a crime than we are using when we're doing the overt engagement. So yes, it creates more demand, but it's demand that was there anyway and expectations that were on us. Do we go to the point that we say we're not going to be on social media, or do we actually use that as a way that we all can engage and influence and be part of it and be real time? And it's never about only information on social. It's part of the wider communications and engagement approaches. We don't say you can only engage or report a crime online. We say this is a choice for you that we will service, and hopefully to the better standards than we have in the past.
Thank you. And there's a couple more questions for you that are on similar kinds of issues, I think, both of which kind of address the diversity of accounts, which you mentioned. Yeah. So I've got really noisy air conditioning in here, but it's not coming through. The first is specific: is there a move in policing to remove individual officers' social media accounts and only use more corporate accounts? And there's a second, more expansive version of that, which is really thinking about again the diversity of accounts and squaring the national picture with individual actors, chief constables. Some chief constables are very active, for example. The way the neighbourhood teams might use this, and whether they would continue to use it as individual accounts. And then there's influences. The example, influencers rather. The example is UK Cop Humour, and there are many others, of course. How are they, or are you even attempting to bring all that together, or are they just different ways?
Yeah, it's about thinking about the digital estate strategy and the purpose. So why, firstly, are we using social media, and then what is the best way to do it? Now, what we're not saying, and we've never said, is it's about removing number of people contributing to the police social media accounts. Most typical forces are using 300 to 500 licenses on their social media management platform, so we can enable the voices from the front line and the stories to come from the neighbourhood teams out on a channel that makes it more relevant to the public. So we're thinking of it from the public terms, not our own terms. And we've had forces who've really rationalised quite severely the number of accounts they've got. We've got one force in the northeast that's gone from several hundred social media accounts to 5. But the impact that's had is a massive increase in the confidence, more intelligence coming back and more responses. And actually they're sending out more updates per day on those 5 accounts than they were before, because they're targeting them at relevant communities, etc. So it's a matter of thinking of it from the public's eyes, not the user's eyes. And we've had lots of conversations with policing where we have these accounts, but when we did the deep dive into the analysis of the account, this account was for the purposes of engaging with the public. 95% of the followers were members of the police service. So it wasn't doing its purpose. So we put them on an account which was 95% of the public and usually 2 or 3 times the size. So we're actually putting that content and allowing them to use it. That is the model that we're pushing forward with in terms of that. And we do want, the credible, trusted voices of what the public keep telling us they want us to be. So we have to be that police. And we did a lot of work with children and young people in particular. And they said, stop dancing, stop trying to be cool on social media, be the police. Make sure we get the same experience in person as we do on the social media approach. In terms of UK corporate humour, we are engaged with lots of different agencies, but we've also under immense scrutiny under policing at the moment in terms of the way we're behaving on social media. So it's really important we follow those police values, that we're building that credibility and trust with the public and the recruits that are coming into policing, given the uplift that we're going through. So we are trying to do all of those things, but it's each force is making their own decision based on the evidence that we've been working to develop over years and years and years, making sure that every account is monitored, because there's nothing worse than, in terms of the trust and confidence, if we don't respond and are not seen to respond to accounts. And if it's just down to a single officer on the ground with their personal native use of social media, what happens when they're off duty and somebody decides to disclose on the DM that they've been a victim? Why should that be sitting with the officer when there's a control room there who go through 39 weeks training to be able to do that? So it's about building structures to support that local content in a way that works and to bring it back to that policing purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just one follow up. And do you think there's a version of the future where individual police officers, at least while they're serving, are not allowed to have social media accounts as police officers?
I think it again goes back to the purpose of why are they on social media. I use social media, and I don't think many people actually understand how each platform works and aren't using it effectively. I use Facebook effectively, professionally and personally. People don't see the personal social media in terms of the grandchildren, but they can see the professional profile and the content. I can manage it. Similarly with Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. We have to become professional social media users in the role that we're in. And I think that's the important bit. And, we are encouraging people to be less overt on their personal use of social media, but we're not saying don't use social media.
Thank you. Carl, I see you've posted something in the chat, some work on the content that police receive. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, and sorry, David's brilliant presentation was giving me flashbacks to one of the first reports I have actually ever wrote at Demos on social media. So it's back in 2013, and it was kind of I think it basically is just another window into exactly the one that David was talking about. So we were kind of building some classifiers to help us with the deluge, but we essentially took a kind of slice in time of just Twitter messages at that point being sent to the main Metropolitan Police UK account. And we're finding exactly that there was, we kind of categorized them, but there was live intelligence being sent on there and stuff that should be acted on, requests for help, overtures, along with obviously like tons of nonsense, lobbying, like seemingly coordinated attempts to change police behavior, and completely nonsensical stuff as well. Of course, social media typically wraps up all these things together. I've always thought that kind of a huge challenge for the police really is the way in which like it's actionable, if not kind of absolutely vital and urgent messaging is kind of nestled in there amongst lots of garbage in ways where it's not necessarily obvious how to identify it. People often use the metaphor of like it's searching for a needle in a haystack, but it's actually searching for a piece of hay in a larger pile of other hay. I mean, they all look the same. Like there's no magnet to get the needle out. So there's a big analytical challenge. Basically, we were pointed to in 2013. David, I don't know how you guys have got on since then with that.
We've come a long way, and building that 24/7 capability has worked really well in the control rooms to triage, because yes, it can take half a second to triage out something, and the way we've built the requirements, all these nice comments back when we've done something good are opportunities to build confidence. So building in the capability to click like when somebody says something nice as a way of also closing the call down helps to build that visibility that we are listening as well. So it is a challenge, but it's we cannot afford to miss those opportunities of the intel, or to help people who need help. If you think about the success of the BTP text messaging service when you're on a train and you want help, you know, it's a similar sort of thing with social media. So all those things, it is a challenge, but you know, because we have designed a technical requirement, we've been able to build in triaging tools to build in so that we can identify those calls for help and take priority over that. And just to give everybody an idea of context, a couple of months ago, the Met took 50% of its demand through online channels, that's web and social, compared to and 50% on telephony. So the world has turned this way. Could we have coped by taking that 50% on telephony as well? No, we haven't got enough call handlers to do that. So we are able to do it better through this way.
Thanks very much. There's a couple more questions for Lisa. The first, I'll ask them both. First is, so what's the difference between an incel and a male who has narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic traits that he uses, you know, that's implicated in the abuse of women? And the second is about the background of people in this movement, such as what professions are they in? Do they have power over people in those professions? Does that have an impact on the way they actually behave?
Okay, I think so. The first point about the connection with something like narcissistic personality disorder, I think we do need to be really quite cautious about pathologizing incels as well. I certainly wouldn't want to kind of stigmatize anybody with mental health issues or make that connection and say, oh, every incel has mental health issues. That's certainly not the case. I think going back to, obviously, the purpose of my research was really to try and highlight that I said that this is not happening in isolation. This is part of a broader continuum of misogyny. And so, yes, there might be some people that are more predisposed because of certain conditions, but for me, it's very much the focus on societal attitudes as well, and that sort of reinforcement and validation as well about the exploitation of women. So I really sort of didn't investigate that, and as I said, I think we do need to be quite cautious as well, in terms of making those sorts of connections. And the second question about the sort of demographics and background, I'm not aware of any research that's gone sort of in depth into that. I did certainly ask my interview participants about their professional experiences and things, and they were certainly at great pains to emphasize that they were really highly educated and often in sort of professional jobs. I really want to avoid any sort of stereotyping, but there was a connection with IT jobs. Again, that's just for my participants, small sample. But which actually seems contradictory to the other sort of way that they like to present themselves in terms of complete abject failure. So I thought I think it's the kind of like to have that kind of, oh look, we're important as outside of our sort of relationship and sexual statuses as well. But they didn't really sort of go into any sort of detail about whether or not they kind of were able to abuse those positions, certainly. And I mein, again, I think we need to be kind of mindful as well that incels are not homogenous. There's not like one particular type of incel. In terms of their affiliation with the philosophy and ideology, that runs on a continuum, on a scale as well, in terms of how much they are fully ensconced into that worldview and the communities. So I think, it's quite a nuanced area, really.
Okay. Thanks, thank you. Yes, and this is a question for the whole panel, but it's also particularly aimed at you, Lisa. So perhaps we'll go to you first, and then bring in others. Is what do the panel feel is a solution to the problem of the parity of esteem of information? I think all of you touched on that in some respects, really. I'm particularly interested in Lisa's views on how the misinformation, misuse of theories to sustain themselves, and how this might be deconstructed and challenged.
Well, I think there's a real problem, not just with incels, but online, about things like anti-feminist rhetoric at the moment, which it's almost like the last taboo, that it's not considered. So, I mean, obviously there's lots of discussions about whether or not misogyny is a hate crime things, and I'm not going to get into that. But certainly it seems like that things like the denigration of women and say anti-feminist rhetoric, is not being challenged enough. And certainly we've got the online harms bill coming through, and gender's not considered, which is really unfortunate. So I think there really needs to be that recognition that there is this problem for starters. And certainly I think Carl could probably speak far better to this than I can, but things like obviously the algorithms and echo chambers, where they are so people that might start just innocuously Googling something to do with dating relationships, and then they're just fed constantly this disinformation, and so we need to be able to sort of counteract that with counter narratives, offer them the actual alternatives that that actually are factually and evidentially and scientifically based. But yeah, I think it's obviously working with the tech companies and platform providers, which they're not really taking this particular subject seriously, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Carl, do you want to come in there?
Thanks. Yeah. So the information curation kind of architectures underlying all these platforms is optimized to maximize attention and time on the platform. It's ever been thus. The underlying philosophy of exactly how they can best achieve that has changed, and there's a kind of like not quite a hidden history, but certainly I think a history which isn't particularly appreciated, where especially on YouTube, but actually across all of them, there's a period of time going from around 2013-14 up to around 2019 where the information curation kind of architectures really did serve up content which was ever more increasingly extreme and engaging in its view to people that were going down certain kinds of rabbit holes. That meant that over that time, the kind of information ecosystem which millions of people lived in really wasn't in any way a fair exchange of ideas at all. It was giving attention to to millions and millions of people, billions and billions and billions of minutes spent in front of actually very extreme material. Lots of online internet subcultures kind of owe their existence really to that period of time, and it was the same on Reddit. So whether it's the Manosphere, or whether it's certain kinds of radical rejectionists of capitalism, or whether it's actually lots of kind of radical kind of cyber Islamist ideologies, or fash wave and the far right, especially the far right really, all of them really were kind of really became kind of broad-based in that period of time, and latterly companies in the face of a tremendous amount of political pressure have tried to kind of tone down and defang the way in which that information creation works. But to me now, looking back at that time, the damage has already been done. They've created a series of kind of a teeming and populous series of kind of subcultures on the extreme end of the political spectrums, which are now well capitalized, well organized, and far more kind of far more kind of popularly based and large, I think, than a lot of people in mainstream society still believe. We have yet to see them really spill into mainstream elections, but their time is coming, and will happen sooner or later. I won't be surprised if there's basically politicians echoing incel tropes at the next election in the UK and certainly in the US, and we're already seeing that happening with conspiracy theorists. So yes, information curation, the plumbing of these platforms is a very important part of the story of our recent kind of political and cultural history. And it caused terrible harm.
Thank you. That's slightly depressing. David, have you got anything to come in there with how the police kind of operate in this landscape?
Yeah, if you think about the conversation we had shortly about the estate strategy as well, that's to exploit the platform's weaknesses in terms of the algorithms. So if we have got more people already connected to our accounts, we have a lot more interaction on a regular basis. That all helps our voice and the little blue tick to stand above and to be that credible, trusted voice. So we have to exploit, target, and implement and encourage people to bring those challenges and misinformation to us so we can put that voice across when it's right. So it's a combination of me understanding the technologies, exploiting the technologies so that we make sure we are designing in to be credible and to be the place that people come to when they need us to help stop that rumor. Stop, what is the fact that, oh, there's a child been abducted in this area? No, actually, it was a kid walking to school who jumped out in front of a van driver and he got shouted at and went and told the school the story. We've solved the problem. We understand. Here's the facts. That quells that concern, and we can only do that if we've already built that trust and credibility and have the link and influence and reach into those communities to built on that. So it all comes as part of that behaviours or an approach to using social media as to why the police are often the credible, trusted voice in the communities when they want to know that something's going on. And quite often people bring those misinformation to policing, expect us to deal with it, where, again, as we've already said, there's very little chance that sometimes that we can deal with some of that because it hasn't reached the criminal thresholds. So at least we can put that voice out there and be that broker effectively for the community.
Great, thank you. And our last two questions both address similar kinds of issues. And I think we'll go to you first with these, David. Although they're open to the others as well, as it relates to the current challenges, or the challenges full stop, in gathering usable evidence that can be presented in court from social media platforms. And specific questions: has it got any easier in recent years, or has it actually got more difficult? And then there's the other question is very similar: what are the challenges involved in actually bringing some of this material to court as evidence? That's a whole other discussion, isn't it? But
yeah,
you got any at the top of the head?
I can only really talk about the earned social media because that's the area we focused on with my area of business. So in terms of, we headed off at the start of by designing it by default that the evidence would be tamper-proof, tamper evidence. We would reduce the burden on investigators to go back and do SPOC requests for deleted content, etc. by default, so that we wouldn't have those challenges in court as to, if you think about it, 101 and 999 audio recordings of what was disclosed doesn't get challenged, the validity of those recordings, because everybody's used to them in the legal process. We had to build in that same assurance from the start for all the people who are disclosing things. In terms of the investigation side, as I say, I haven't really got involved in that side, so I can't offer a great deal of help more than that.
I can offer a quick point on this. So I'm obviously not a police officer, but I have spent time embedded in cybercrime units, and we do quite a lot of kind of cyber investigation stuff ourselves. And if there's one huge problem here, it seems to me that if you set aside, I think quite often people think, oh, well, the problem is like maybe skills or maybe technology or maybe equipment. And it seems to me actually the police has done a lot to actually acquire all those things. To me, the problem's geography, and always has been. So almost every investigation that I've ever seen that either kind of sat alongside police officers or ones we do ourselves, you're faced with the prospect that evidence, perpetrators and victims are scattered all over the world. You've got perpetrators in country 1, 2, 3, victims 4, 5, 6, 7, and evidence held by services, there might be in half a dozen more. Now, if you're a cybercrime officer in a local constabulary, which is where the vast majority of crime is obviously investigated and cybercrime is still being dealt with, you then are faced with the prospect of having to reach across borders to try and gather all of that in a way which you can bring into a British court. Now, if you're lucky and the evidence is sat, say, in America or a cooperative jurisdiction in the EU, there might be mechanisms which are fairly streamlined for you to go out and get that. Maybe you're a little less lucky and you have to start putting together a business case to form a mutual legal assistance treaty, and there your problem is only time and money. But if you're unlucky, and this is sat deliberately in many cases in jurisdictions where there'll be a kind of some laughter coming back at the phone if a British police officer tries to secure cooperation from say a Russian service provider or a bulletproof hoster that might be sat on a server in an Eastern European country, you have no prospect really of being able to summon that evidence or get those perpetrators to appear in a British court at all. So in many cases, time and time again, I saw investigations essentially fall apart due to this problem of geography. In some cases, the local police forces that I spoke to and spent time with weren't allowed to speak to people in other countries. And in many cases, even if they were, the cost and difficulty of them even dealing with, like, you know, say a local, to give an example, a local kid had DDoSed his school. Like that, if that wasn't a digital investigation, that would have been dealt with in a very, very local way. You got the kid, you got the school, you got the parents. But he'd use Amazon Web Services to do it. So you had to go to America. They got the wrong data back, and at that point, there wasn't even a business case for them to go back and get use another MLAT. So I think, you know, there's no mistake now that cybercrime is one of the least reported forms of crime to police, and it's got one of the lowest conviction rates of the crime that's actually being reported. So I think there is a crisis of sorts happening with the capacity of the police to enforce the law online. It's not just UK police, it's police forces all over the world. And it's really just got to do with the fact that we are enforcing laws in ways which are to do with within geographic pockets of a kind of a form of crime which is inherently transnational. I haven't really seen anyone come up with a good answer to that, to be honest with you. I think that probably a not complete, but some form of answer would be for us to begin to kind of elevate digital policing to the national level. So rather than have like 30 odd like small cybercrime units, us begin to deal with that on a national basis in an institution which is basically designed to reach across borders and secure cooperation across at least the bits of the world that will have something to do with British police. If not actually, you know, beginning to act in a more extraterritorial way, justice without jurisdiction, and potentially finding other ways of levying costs against people that are victimizing British citizens. But yes, I think it's an excellent final question for us to dwell on, because there are huge problems with catching anything but the most naive and stupid cyber criminals. I don't think that British police has kind of, and indeed any police, have kind of got the answers to this yet. In many cases, like what I actually hear from the police is a sense of, it's not really our job to deal with some of this stuff. You know, it's the job of Facebook or Twitter or the service providers, which is a bit of a scary thing to hear, because like, it's not the job of private companies to enforce the law online, like point blank. It's a job of warranted police forces under democratic control.
Great, thank you. Yeah, lots to mull on there, and in general, I mean, as I was suggesting, and through three really great presentations, we only just scratched the surface of the complexity of this area. It's not really the right word, domain within policing and criminal justice and law enforcement. And I certainly could have talked for longer, but we'll wrap up there. We've run out of questions. Please do sign up for the next seminar, which is soon, which is on Tuesday, the 8th of March. So only 2 weeks' time, on evidence-based policing. We've got Karen Bullock, Jack Green, and Alex Murray from the Met talking at that one. So please sign up on that. If I could ask the panelists just to stay online just for 1 second, we'll close there. And thanks very much for attending, everyone.